So as you saw before, you can see it in Chrome, but if you have something like WebStorm, I'm pretty sure there's the equivalent in VS Code for doing this. But then you can actually have your editor run these API calls for you. So you can say like, all right, you get this answer back if you make this request, and then you can use some of it for doing like a new one. And so on and so forth, and you can keep getting information and dealing with it. Before we talk a bit more APIs, I actually want to go to the last part of this lesson and then come back to APIs, which is how do we deal with APIs from JavaScript. To do that, we have something called fetch. Oh, that's one way, and right now the easiest way is that you say fetch, you give it the URL that it should go load, then once you do, then where you take in the response, you recognize this as a callback. You do .json, says pass this as JSON, and then once that get back, then you get some data back, and then you can do something with it. So let's try doing it with this deck of cards API, where I have I can do a new one. So let's just split it up here. If I do fetch this URL, then with that response, convert it into JSON, then with whatever I get back, console.log that. So with sending out a request, reading it as JSON, and then logging out the resulting object. If I can find my Chrome instance here. So as you can see here, I get it back just like we saw before in Chrome. But then, alright, with this here, I actually only want to deal with the deck ID for some reason. Then I only get the ID of the new deck here. Just like we had an ID on the orders, we have IDs on decks of cards.
If I sign it to available, I can use it in the next API?
Exactly. So if we just have deck ID is equal to response dot deck ID. Notice how the casing here doesn't have to be the same. Over here it's like with an underscore, and here it's in camel casing. Then we can use that for fun things. So we can do so just log.
Should be inside or outside again?
If we want to do it after we've gotten this and we want to use the thing, we have to do it inside.
Can't use it outside.
No, and we'll get into why. But let's just quickly have a look here. Template. And then do. So we put in the deck ID here. There. And then again, then res.json, then log second response res. So you can see we send a request, we get the response back. We send a new request using some of that data, which is also kind of why we can't move it out here, because if I move it down here, then where's that deck ID from? That's only available up here in this callback. And this gets into something even worse called
but if I make a return for that function, I make fetch.
So if you do like this, yeah, so what you get back here is actually a promise. So this deck ID I can call then on, and that's what I can do with it, because this is something in JavaScript called asynchronous behavior. So if you just comment this out, try to notice when I refresh the page whether or not this appears instantly. So you can see there's actually a very, very tiny delay. And that's the delay from actually going over the network. So if I do zoom out here a bit so I can see my things. I have this now we're on really slow 3G internet out in the total boomers of nowhere. We load the page and now we load some JavaScript. So the JavaScript executed very, very fast. And then it took a while for the actual response to come back. That is because this is executing what we call asynchronously. It's just starts the request and then it starts doing other things like rendering the JavaScript or rendering CSS and HTML. And then once it comes back, it executes our callback. You know, remember how when we work with events, they also just happened at some point. They didn't happen right away. The click event didn't happen right away once you add event listener. It actually waits until you click on the page. In this case, there's like an event for saying this is now loaded. Do something with it.
So if I make it outside and I start, it will not take the other response?
Exactly. So if we do this, so let's just try. And for now not have this one because otherwise it will be really, really weird. And let's not have this one be super ultra mega slow. You can actually see here it says deck ID is not defined, and only after that does it actually log out our response. But if we take it and put it in here, and then we load, you can see it'll actually get us the first response. It'll wait just a teeny tiny second, and then it'll write out the second one. So you can see it's not instant. Like all of this up here, it's practically instant.
I think the second response comes before the first response, doesn't it?
No. It comes right here. First response, second response. What you see in the console is the exact order in which things happen.
The way you load it, it looks like if you refresh that page.
No, it's just because it's moving up.
Okay,
because it's adding more things in the bottom.
Yeah.
So
it just fetch some data.
Yep.
From somewhere.
Yeah. From some random guy on the internet who has a server that returns JSON.
How about if we have a variable outside the fetch and then save it with a response to deck ID?
So you could. So you're thinking like this, and then we move this down.
Outside, yeah.
So let's just look at what the value of deck ID here is. It's actually, one thing is all the errors down here. What's actually happening is pretty important, is up here. It's logging out undefined on this line because the value has not been set to anything, which is also why this gives undefined, because then it'll try to load /deck/undefined, which, as the name says, doesn't make sense because it's undefined. So you have to put it in here so they happen in order. A thing you can do, they tell me not to teach you this, but I think it's kind of really important to understand, is that you can actually do this. So promises has this really fun behavior where if you in a callback in a promise returns another promise, then that will be the promise you're waiting on next time around. So as you can see, this loads exactly the same way, but there is slightly less nesting. So one thing is if we go back, and then like after this one we would then do a third one like this. Then we have then and then inside each other, and at some point we'll get outside the screen here, which should be really kind of annoying. So we can take these .then calls, and we can move them down here, and they'll actually chain, just like how we did with arrays. So we had these array map filter, and they will also chain. And they tell me first to teach you this next time, but I think it's pretty important for understanding promises. So you can see it'll do one, then the third, the second, and then the third.
So promise is attribute?
What?
Promise is attribute you can use?
Promise is a variable of type promise, just like you have a value of type string or type number.
Or something coming later.
Yeah, a promise is essentially, like it says on the tin, it's a promise that something will arrive, or you'll get an error, but one of those at some point. It doesn't say anything about how fast, so it could in theory be in 10 minutes, or in 2 hours, or in this case, 100 milliseconds, which is pretty much more than normal.
Just because you mentioned it about the fold. If I get fold now, what I should do? I don't try it.
If you get an error now?
Yes.
So if you want to handle errors like this, there's a .catch.
It promises you get something if the code is right, or you get an error if the code is wrong.
Yeah, but you can get, like, if we in here throw new error, bad code, then it'll actually go down into the catch, error, bad code. We're going to be looking more into promises next time, but I just wanted to show an example of how you can put these things after each other, rather than putting them inside each other. If you are kind of stuck like I am at work and have to support IE, then you have to use something called XML HTTP request, which is annoying to put it the least. I think it's response text, and then we can do JSON.parse, and then request.open, and we want to open this as a get to this, and then request.send. Alternatively, this would be the equivalent. So, but as you can imagine, if I now want to, after I run this one, I want to do another, then I need to do and then at some point you get really tired of typing a very lot of code, and we're not done yet.
This is just to support Internet Explorer.
Yep, because Internet Explorer does not support fetch. Yes.
Didn't they say that they were doing Internet Explorer based on Chromium?
Yes, they're doing this thing called Edge. The fun thing is Microsoft doesn't support Internet Explorer on half their sites anymore, but we still have to because our customers use Edge or IE. So
All this should be inside Pitch. Instead of Pitch.
yes, if you have to work with IE. And as you can see, then you're in the print more. This looks a lot like where you before when you handed clicks with buttons and such. So you had something, and then at some point it loads, which is just an event, and then you can start reading out the response text on that. But you have to deal with all this open and send, which, if you know how the HTTP protocol works, makes a lot of sense. It's just annoying. Like all programs in the whole wide world that has to use this. It spends about 5 minutes making something that looks like this. And then Google looked and we're like, why don't we just include that in the standard then? And then they did that. Yeah.
So use fetch or use request?
Use fetch, unless you need to support IE. And then you need to use request.
Yeah.
So for everything that you will be doing here at Hack Your Future, supporting Chrome itself or Firefox, is fine. You don't need to support IE. But if you get into enterprises where you're selling to other enterprises, you usually have to support IE. If you go to your bank, they'll probably have to support IE because old people have old computers. That's for some reason still runs IE.
We actually use they don't use IE. They use Chrome. Even on the internet.
Yeah, but if you go, there are also countries. If you go to lots of places in China and India.
Using 2007.
Yeah, they're using Windows 2007, but like a lot of places they're still using IE9. Because they just have computers that are that old. They might have a computer from 2000.
I have two computers at home. I have a laptop from 2009 and the other Mac is also from 2009.
Yeah, but Mac usually, like most reasonable people just download Chrome and call it a day. All people might not have that opportunity. Sometimes, like, these computers are just locked down so much that your company might say you're only allowed to use IE. And you're only allowed to access these 3 sites on it. And then you're just stuck. You have to support IE if you want to sell to those people. And then if you figure out the old way,
Just before we move, I have a question about the auth key.
The what?
Auth?
Yes.
It's something we add in the. I use it with that request HTML, but if I want to fetch, it's also I can use also that the request way where you add the auth and the API key.
Yeah. So some APIs they require you to actually specify some sort of authentication to verify that you're you. For example, on Facebook, I can't just send a request to post a new post on your Facebook page.
No.
Like I have to be authenticated as you for that to work. In which case, we need to send some sort of auth. And how that is done, that depends a lot on the APIs. Most newer APIs have in their headers this header called, and I don't know why, it's needed for authentication, but it's called authorization.
Yes.
And just so we are very clear on what authentication versus authorization is, authentication means verifying that you are you. Like verifying that that's Vale we're talking to. Authorization deals with verifying that do you actually then have access to this thing? So, like, do you have access to actually be posting on this wall?
Somebody else give you the permission to do that.
Yep. Exactly. And that's why the fact that this is called authorization, when it's used for authentication, is really bad. So what most APIs nowadays have is they have a header, then the value starts with bearer, and then some sort of very, very, very long token here that you got from somewhere. Some APIs, they just put it up here and say token equal something. Other APIs use something called cookies, which I can't really show you because that's usually pretty invisible. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be done.
But having the token on a URL like that is not a good idea, is it?
If you're using HTTPS, it doesn't matter.
But here a question, because like this $sign about the variable, we don't use it before in the JavaScript yet. I don't have very big idea about it, but I can use it also when I want to write the OR.
I'm sorry, I did not understand the question.
Like the $sign, we don't use it in JavaScript before. Nobody teaches us about it yet.
No, but it essentially means that like doing, yes, so this is exactly the same as saying this.
Yeah, that I mean. I can use it down in the link also, this $sign.
Yeah. Because this just takes a string, and this just produces a string.
Okay.
It doesn't.
Are you talking about string templates?
No, because sometimes when you want to do that, the response are like that. maybe you want to add the auth or something like automatically for the link or you get.
Yeah.
So I'm asking if I want to use the dollar, so I can add the key automatically without entering manual.
Like then you still have to refer to a variable, of course. But what usually happens is that you have some. You have that fetch or XML HTTP request, and then you do function send request URL, and then down here it just says URL plus equal and token equal to some token that you got from somewhere. That is then being stored somewhere else. So and then it of course goes fetch URL, and then you can do send request, and then just don't worry about it. Then you can just pass in your string. So that is one of the benefits of functions. You don't have to worry about what they really do internally, as long as they are doing what you expect them to, including making sure that you have your authorizations set. Because yes, you're entirely correct. If you don't use something like this, then you have to remember to put it everywhere. Which can get out of hand really fast and become kind of annoying also, because then you have to deal with checking, like, am I logged in which case I need to include it. If I'm not logged in, then I don't need to include it, because then I'm expecting different data, which again, put that in other functions and then have those deal with it, so you only need to write it once, because especially with things like authorization or authentication, getting it wrong can result in some really bad things. If you're lucky, whatever you did just won't work. If you're unlucky, it'll work in a really bad way.
In the opposite way.
Yes. Hopefully, if your server is working correctly, it'll just say you're not logged in, go away, if you forgot to include it. If not, some servers deal with you they allow you to be not logged in, but you'll see different things. For example, on Twitter, you can go and load someone's tweet if they're public. But if you are logged in, then you might also see if you have retweeted that tweet, which you of course can't see if you're not logged in. So like this, the results might change a bit depending on how you request them and how you authenticate and authorized. And it says here in this to somehow show you how to deal with those. They did not give you an example of an API that needed that. So next time when we're talking about promises, I'll set up something that we can interact with that has a very, very easy to deal with authorization API. So we just send in a username and then we get a key back, and then we can use that without having to deal with all sorts of strange things. Because once you get really into the details of security, doing login, like you could do write a master's degree about how to do login correctly, because it's really difficult. There's a reason why why Facebook spends so much money and why Google spends so much money on it. Why you can't just go to some page, enter your Google credentials and then log in that way. Why do they actually redirect you to Google and then redirect back once they're logged in?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually security reasons for this. And yeah, understanding those can be really difficult, but we can work with a simplified versions of these and then just say we are aware that this is not the best way to do security, but for the sake of learning how to deal with things.
How about the sessions? How does JavaScript handle sessions? Does it handle sessions?
Well, if you're using JavaScript and sessions, then you don't have to worry about it. If you're using JavaScript in the browser, you don't have to worry about sessions, because sessions is something that stores server-side.
Yeah.
The reason why we have something called sessions is because HTTP, which we use to load these pages, are what we call a stateless protocol. When you send something to load the HTML and then send a request to load the JavaScript, the server doesn't know that it's the same person both times, because it doesn't have to be. So what we usually do to achieve something called sessions, so we know it's the same person requesting, we put a cookie on them. That's why you have seen on all these pages, hey, do you accept that we use cookies here to track you and then sell all your information? Yes, and you kind of have to, because that's how they know, that's how they keep following you around, because inherently they can't see that the request, especially when we're like this, like once the request goes out of my PC, then it might as well have come out of Ricardo's PC, because it goes to the access point and then from there it goes to some web server somewhere. And unless I put some extra data in that request, they won't know that it was from me compared to Ricardo. So that's when you use sessions then to remember, well, who are we talking about? Most APIs try to be a bit more stateless about this, so you have to actually inform it each time explicitly saying, hey, I'm Rasmus. Please remember that I just talked to you 2.5 seconds ago and now I want this thing. Because that allows it to scale better. But we'll get to that once we start digging into Node, which I think is...
So those cookies are something that we just let them to store our information?
Yeah, a cookie is just a small text file on your computer that stores something. Text, JSON. Sometimes they just store an ID, and then on the server they get that ID. They then look up in a database. Oh, it was you. Yes. Now I know what you were talking about. And you also have access to post on this Facebook wall, or he might not. So, but I will get into that more once we start working with servers. Because then we'll actually need to be dealing with these things. When we're dealing with JavaScript, we usually don't have to deal with cookies because that just works in the browser automatically. That's how browsers worked forever before we got JavaScript. Now we just have better ways of dealing with it in JavaScript.
Can we take a break then?
Yes, and once we come back from that, next exercise, need to use this API. That, as you can see, it returns some JSON about the current astronauts on the IIS. And then we need to write things out. So fetch the data, put it into the DOM. So we'll go with a 10 minutes break, and then we'll look at this exercise 20 minutes past 6. Okay?
Or did this one already?